still open. This is an old and somewhat sacred tradition of the Manor Club. You have always been proud of this philanthropic effort, and I would urge you to please contribute to it this year. I'm sure these kids need it more than ever. So, as you know, we have teachers choose one from the Bridge Advantage program and one from the Theater Arts program, both of which seem to be better reflective of our values. So I would urge you to make a contribution, ever how big or small. The raffle. Carla, Celeste, Cheryl, who did I forget?
Chris Allen.
All of you have been active in creating these wonderful themed baskets that are available for a raffle. So please contribute to that. It has been helpful with our fundraising efforts this year. So I would urge you, Carla has tickets, and you can also go up to.
We cannot hear you.
And purchase tickets. So please do.
We cannot hear you.
The annual meeting will be on May 18th. Hoping to be able to hold it in person here in the theater. You will be able to vote.
There's no sound.
Of officers for next year. Also, the current board members will be delivering short annual reports, so you will get an idea of some of the things that we did, even though we haven't been having in-person.
No sound.
You have to turn your volume off, Carla.
Then reminder, turn off your phones.
Still no sound.
Everybody, and I hope you enjoy the program. I can't imagine that you won't. He's so entertaining and wonderful. Let me just give you a little bit about Bill Miller. He's referred to as Mr. Ocean Liner, and he is an international authority on ocean liners and cruise ships, and has written over 60 books on subjects ranging from early steamers, immigrant ships, to liners at war. He will discuss the floating palaces of the past, as well as the current generation of cruise ships, the floating resorts, and present a visual account including many of the fabulous interiors and the collectible artifacts. Sure to be an exciting voyage that we're all going to look forward to taking. So welcome, Bill, and he will go down in history as the first in-person speaker at the Manor Club since COVID. Welcome, Bill Miller.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
At Liverpool, the three canard liners met together for the first time, and 2.5 million people came out to see the Queen Mary II, the Queen Victoria, and the Queen Elizabeth sail. Cunard's home was Liverpool, and it was a wonderful day. The sun came out. It was just wonderful, and so forth. No rain showers. And as I said, 2.5 million people. But I met a lady on the deck afterward, and she looked rather sad and grim. And I said, "What's the matter?" She said, "Oh, I was so disappointed." I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "I only saw 2 ships." She didn't realize she was on the third, but anyway, we'll leave it at that. Today, now, why isn't this not going? I don't know. Forward. Today, there's over 300 cruise ships in the world. Sailing by ship is by no means over, but I'm going to tell you about the old days of ocean liners. When you sailed to Europe, you didn't go to Kennedy or LaGuardia to fly. Today, cruise ships are gigantic, carrying 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 passengers at one time. And at the moment, there's over 100 new ships being built for an industry that keeps expanding and growing. Millions and millions of people take cruises every year. And the design of cruise ships today are floating resorts, floating hotels, rock climbing walls, stone carving centers, a special learn to cook eateries, all sorts of magnificent things and so forth. In 2003, I was in France at a shipyard where they were building 5 new ocean liners at one time. I was there to write a book about a ship called the Crystal Serenity rather. But no one paid attention to that ship or the other 3 because all the attention was focused on the new Queen Mary II. Cunard Line, which is a very famous British company, was bought by Carnival Corporation of Miami in 1998 for $600 million, and they immediately invested $800 million to build a new ocean liner, the Queen Mary II, to sail New York to England 6 months of the year like the old days, and so forth. And so the Queen was delivered in December 2003, the first liner taller than the Statue of Liberty, 17 decks, magnificent. Everyone's excited. She could sail between England and New York in 5 days. She finally got to England and she was named by the Queen in January 2004. The Queen's grandmother had named the old Queen Mary. Her mother had named the old Queen Elizabeth. She named the Queen Elizabeth II, and now she was naming the Queen Mary II. And that's Commodore Warwick, master of the ship. I grew up in a place called Hoboken, New Jersey, on the banks of the Hudson River. Famous probably, yes, as a seaport city, factories, but also famous for that singer, you know, Blue Eyes. What's his name? Frank something. Anyway, he came from Hoboken. And as a boy in the 50s, I had a front row seat on the Hudson River to watch all the liners sail to Europe. And in those days, the New York Times and the old New York Herald Tribune had a schedule in the paper every day listing the ships that were sailing. And I began to write about them and collect. And now, just to update Celeste's lovely introduction, I've about to get ready for my 110th book on ocean liners being published in England and also in Holland. But let's go back over 100 years. There's no jets, there's no moon landings, there's no COVID. Cunard Line and England have the biggest ships in the world. They are mechanical marvels, belching coal smoke out of the 4 big smokestacks. And inside, they were divided, 500 up top in first class, 500 in the middle, kind of like business class, and 1,000 down below in steerage, the immigrants coming to America for the first time. And the Mauretania, which you see here from 1907, could make it in 6 days from England to New York, the fastest of all. And of course, the ships were marvels to the public, these huge floating palaces, everything about them was spectacular. And you can see here that the idea of such things in that age, long before television and, you know, internet and so forth, to see a photograph like this of a mechanical marvel, like a great ocean liner that could move across the seas. And so then to work for Cunard as a stewardess or a waiter or shoveling coal down in the bunkers was an honor. Parents actually bribed the company agents just to get a job on those ships, because to go to America, even as a crew member, was a wonderful experience. Inside, in first class, they were designed to look like land. They copied the architecture of manor houses, palaces, wonderful estates, even Turkish and exotic Moorish concoctions. The idea was you would sit in a lounge and forget that you were actually on a moving ship that might be rolling and pitching across the Atlantic. But if you closed the drapes, you were sitting in a room that looked like land, and maybe you were just a little less queasy. The best woods, the best glass, stained glass ceilings, the best everything was used in first class, gold-plated taps in the first class cabins. It was the French in 1912 that introduced something that was unique. They put a grand staircase into the first class restaurant on their new ship, the SS France of 1912. Now, in those days, on a week's voyage to Europe, you dressed every night except the first and the last. That's dressed with 5 S's in the middle. So it was gowns, furs, and jewels. And by the second or third night, ladies would come in, come down half of the staircase, and sort of look out to see where their table was, even though they knew where it was. And they would pause And the other passengers would stop and look up and see Madame make the grand descent into the dining room. And that staircase brought more first-class ladies and passengers on the French line than any others. It was part of the whole concept of meeting. But on the same ship, 10 decks below, was steerage. The people who paid $10 a head in 1910 to come to America, to leave Europe for political, religious, or economic reasons. And this is where the companies, some companies, you actually had to bring your own knife and fork. Cunard Line did provide that, and so forth. And it was down in the bottom of the ship. And of course, this was, even though they only paid $10 a head, this is where the companies made their profits, because out of the $10 paid to Cunard, it cost them $4 to carry an immigrant, so $6 was profit. And the business was huge. 1 million people a year came to America on ships and landed in New York, and then went Ellis Island and entered America. A huge process. The immigrants, of course, didn't have any of the, how shall we say, fancy amenities. They were allowed on deck for an hour a day if the weather was all right. They had to entertain themselves and so forth. But it was a huge process. And by 1912, they were arriving at the rate of 10,000 immigrants a day into New York Harbor, going through Ellis Island. And I'm happy to say 98.5% were accepted and proved and started their new lives in the United States. Many years ago, I did the database for Ellis Island and all the ships. There were 818 ships that are listed that carried immigrants over the years. And every year they would have a luncheon to honor a famous immigrant who did well in America. And at this particular luncheon, the honoree couldn't attend. His 72-year-old son came. It was Bob Hope, who was the most famous immigrant in America at the time, at the age of 98. He'd come in third class in 1909 to America and so forth, and he certainly had a good career and contributed to America. The shipping lines wanted and fought to have more immigrants come on their ships. So they put posters out. Now, how did the immigrants pick a ship to spend the $10, which was a lot of money to them? They would go down to a railway station in the village or the pub or the post office and see these big posters of the shipping lines. And remember, America was like going to the moon for those Europeans. The artists of the posters would make the ships look bigger than they really were and the smokestacks taller. And the immigrants began a process that had nothing to do with accuracy or science. They believed that a ship with 2 smokestacks was safer than a ship with 1 smokestack, but that the 3-stack ship was even better. So companies like Cunard began to add fake smokestacks to their ships so the immigrants could count them. The immigrants also had heard that if they were afraid of getting seasick, because they'd heard about it from relatives who'd gone ahead, that if they ate raw onions before they left Europe for a month, they wouldn't get seasick. There's no connection between raw onions and seasickness, but there's the stacks and they would count them. Very often the 3rd or the 4th one was a dummy just put on for the effect of the immigrants. And sometimes the poster lied completely. The immigrants would get to the dock and the ship would have less smokestacks than they thought. Crossing on the voyage was not always easy. You didn't need cha-cha class, obviously. It just rolled its way across the Atlantic. And so the immigrants were often quite ill down in those lower deck quarters. And the North Atlantic could be quite ruthless, even in the summertime. Down below were the stokers, the men who shoveled coal into the furnaces of the great liners. They were 200 men, tough, of course, 4 hours on, 4 hours off. On Cunard, they were tough Liverpool Irish. They were each given a bottle of cheap whiskey every day to work down in those 120-degree bunkers down in the lower holds of the ship. The Mauretania, for example, used 1,000 tons of coal a day and therefore used 6,000 tons for the trip and an extra 1,000 just in case. The men down in the bunkers were known as the black gangs because they were always covered in black coal dust. Today, with cruise ships, the ship comes in the morning, they offload, they clean, they store, and sails out in the late afternoon. In those days, the Mauretania would come in and they'd have to now recoal the ship. So the first thing, it would come in on Monday. On Tuesday, they'd have to cover all the finery up above because the coal dust would find its way up somehow. So then you'd have 3 or 4 days of bunkering the coal into the ship, a day of cleaning and unwrapping, and finally sails a week later. So it was all quite a different process economically. Well, the Cunard Line may have had the biggest ships in the world, but they had rivals. And one of them was called the White Star Line. And they were building 3 new liners that they said would be bigger and better than Cunard. The first was called Olympic, but the second ship, they said, they made improvements in the steel that she's practically unsinkable. Aha, people would say they all want to sail on this new marvel of a ship. So the Titanic set off on its maiden voyage in April 1912. Notice the 4th stack isn't smoking. It's a dummy just for the Irish immigrants to count. She doesn't even have enough lifeboats or life jackets for all the passengers. And she gets ready for a maiden voyage to America. And as fate would have it, off Newfoundland on the maiden voyage, she's ripped open and 3.5, 1,500 on maritime tragedy of its time, only 705 survived. Unbelievable. The Titanic today remains fascinating. Movies, books, documentaries, Mr. Cameron's billion-dollar movie, even a Broadway musical, the story of a ship unsinkable on its maiden voyage, and it sinks anyway. In 1980, I was in Malta in the Mediterranean, and it used to be the special effects film capital for maritime subjects where they had big tanks and they would float huge models to look like reality. And I knew that they made a model for a silly movie in the 70s called Raise the Titanic, in which they supposedly bring it up from the bottom. So I went around to the gate that morning, a very hot August day, and I sort of asked, could I see the model of the Titanic, which was fascinating to me. And the man said, no, no one ever sees the model, it's locked away. I said, well, that's too bad. I've come all the way from Hoboken. He said, Hoboken? My cousin lives in Hoboken, I'll let you in. So he let me in to see the model. And the point of my story is that the model, there it is, cost $7.5 million to make for the movie, the same price the ship cost 60 years before. So with inflation, you now got a model. The Kaiser in Germany was so jealous that Britain had the biggest ships. He wanted even bigger ones. So he introduced 3 giant liners. The first was the Imperator. And as it was being built, he heard that the British were building an even bigger ship. What to do? The Kaiser ordered the German shipping line to put a useless globe and eagle on the bow, which pushed the length of the ship another 20 feet, just so they could beat the British to say they had the biggest ship. In World War I, the liners were called to duty to carry soldiers to the trenches to Europe, and they were painted in camouflage, a series of geometric shapes and colors that made it very difficult for the U-boats to spot them at sea. They almost looked like they meshed into the waves. There was no radar at this time, so it was a way of delivering the soldiers safely across to Europe. This was a heroic time. And when America entered the war in 1917, we were actually using some confiscated German ships to carry American soldiers to fight the Germans that built the ships in the first place. One of the great ironies of history and so forth. But the ships proved to European and American governments that ocean liners were not just valuable in peace, they're valuable in war. For troop ships, hospital ships, transports, all sorts of purposes. So there's more enthusiasm once the war is over. And at the end of the war in 1918, 1919, the liners, of course, brought home many of the dead from the trenches of Europe back to the shores of America. By the 1920s, business is back. The war is over. And of course, New York is the biggest ocean liner port on this side. Southampton, England, over there near London, 2 hours away, is the biggest in Europe. The great express service, 6 days, the fastest way to Europe. And all the biggest liners sail between those ports. Sailing day was a big event. Visitors could go aboard for 10 cents, and you could see the whole glamour of sailing away on a crossing to Europe. Minimum fare was $60. This is the French line, the Paris. Well, the French line had an impeccable reputation for decor, for service, but no one could touch them for food. It was said that more seagulls followed the French liners than any others because the scraps were so good, so forth. You can see on the big liners, you would leave your townhouse in New York or a fancy hotel in London and come down and step aboard a liner in an enchanted world of thick carpets, polished woods, stained glass ceilings, a world of impeccable service, tea at 4. You can see here the indoor pool on the Majestic in the 1920s had a lighted glass ceiling that was designed to resemble daylight. And the Romanesque style, there was a gymnasium attached with a punching bag and a rowing machine. You could actually lose a pound during the voyage. And a spectators gallery up above that passengers could come down and see the other passengers swimming in a saltwater pool. These were the big suites. And Gloria Swanson, for example, would be sailing to Europe with a dozen trunks. And this would be her bedroom. And on the side is a small door for her personal maid, which she would be traveling with. She would also be traveling with her own car and driver, which was in the hold of the ship. So when she got to England, they just offloaded and off they went and tooled away. The big American liner was the Leviathan. We had seized it from the Germans, and now it was the biggest in the American fleet. And on every one of the voyages, you received a gold tasseled passenger list at the day of sailing. And the first thing you did was to open it up to see who famous was on board. Remember, that was the day before YouTube and internet. Famous people were big stars or politicians or royalty or early Hollywood stars. And on one of the trips in 1926 was a lady now long completely forgotten. Queen Marie of Romania was coming to New York on the Leviathan. And the American passengers were gaga. The chance they might meet the Queen on the deck, maybe she'll take a stroll. Well, she didn't come out of her suite, but one of the crew members found an air tube 10 decks down that connected to the Queen's suite, and he could hear her speaking. He sold tickets to the passengers for 10 cents a minute to come down to hear Queen Marie say a few words as she crossed on the Leviathan. Business boomed, and after World War I, started lots of tourism. People had heard from the soldiers of Europe about the bright lights of Paris and the glories of London, the scenery of Switzerland. So now, by the mid-20s, you had two big changes. Number one, coal went out and oil came in. And the second change was the US government started immigration quotas and so forth, so that steerage disappeared. Companies had to go and get out some paint and a little bit of fabric and dress up steerage and call it third class for people on a budget going to Europe, school teachers and secretaries who wanted to go away maybe for the summer sort of thing. And so business boomed and bright days were ahead. In 1927, the French introduced a new ship called the Ile-de-France. Now, the reason it's important, it's not the biggest, but 2 years before, there had been an exhibition in Paris of a new style of decor. We call it Art Deco, which is that futuristic look of light woods and angular furniture. And the Ile-de-France brought it to America. And you can see the main lounge. That's the largest Aubusson carpet in the world, blood red columns, and the ceiling had the first time ever on an ocean liner indirect lighting that sent down in the evenings a soft peach-colored glow that made skin look softer, especially on ladies, and therefore they look younger. They'd go back and they'd say, you know, I don't know what it is about the Ile-de-France, but I look so much better on this ship. I'll be booking next year. So the Ile-de-France was innovative in many, many ways. You can see the style of the suite for the late 20s, the geometric patterns on the furniture, the light woods, the ceiling lights, everything about it was looking to the tomorrow rather than the previous decor, which looked to the past. The dining room on the Ile-de-France was modern Greek temple. The chairs were made a little smaller than normal, so the room looked bigger to the human eye. The beluga was served in silver bowls with soup spoons. There was 2 footmen at every table. You never had to pass the salt. And at dinner, there were 275 items, 8 courses on the dinner menu on the Ile-de-France. By 1929, the Germans were back 10 years after they lost the war with 2 giant ships, the Bremen and the Europa. 6 days from England, 7 days from Germany. Inside was very grand hotel, cigarette smoke, classical music after dinner. You expected to see Joan Crawford or Sidney Greenstreet on board. It was all terribly elegant, sort of very posh. When the ships got to Europe, either to Southampton in England, Cherbourg in France, or Bremen in Germany, a train would be waiting at the dock. So you would get off, get your luggage, and go into the train, which would take you up to London, or to Paris, or to Berlin. And they called it the boat train, and that was for the ease of travel. In 1930, 3 years after Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic, the Germans put a seaplane on the top deck of their ships in a revolving catapult. And about 15 hours before New York, or 15 hours before Europe, they would shoot the plane off with 2 bags of mail and 1 or 2 rich passengers, and they'd be ahead of the actual arrival of the ship. Well, what a novelty. What press. Well, it was clumsy and expensive for the Germans to do this, but the publicity was worth it. A Lufthansa plane shooting off the top deck. The German liners were noted for their midnight sailings from New York. Ladies wrapped in furs, a big pa band playing. And as you sail down the Hudson, New York City glittering like diamonds on black velvet as you sailed out of the harbor, and then a left turn and off to Europe you went, the glamour of those days. The idea of bigger and better stretched to land. And in Manhattan, it moved to skyscrapers that now went to 60, 70 floors. And so things looked bigger and more promising. Everything had to be larger, more extravagant. And by 1931, the tallest building in the world, the Empire State, was completed, 102 floors. And that same kind of fever touched the shipping lines to build bigger and more extravagant and so forth. And you can see they showed what a liner would look like at the time, the Queen Elizabeth, taller on end than the Eiffel Tower. Only the Empire State was bigger. And the decor that the Ile-de-France had started now spread to land, hotels, department stores, theaters, railway stations. Radio City has that sleek Fred and Ginger look of tubular chandeliers, stainless rails, lots of mirrors, lots of space, all begun by the Ile-de-France, the age of Art Deco. And as you well know, it spread to Hollywood, and the great musicals, of course, adopted this with the wonderful sets and so forth. One lady was very lucky. She loved ocean liners. Her husband owned Eaton's department store, a chain in Canada. She had him in the flagship store in Montreal, put a restaurant up on the roof, and it had to look like an ocean liner. So that in those days, when ladies came to shop for the day, they'd shop for dresses in the morning and shoes in the afternoon, or vice versa. They could stop for lunch and think they were in the Ile-de-France in between, the romance of the whole connection of it all. And the ocean liners by the 1930s, like Hollywood itself, invoked a glamour and indulgence. The ivory Jean Harlow phone calling to have breakfast in bed, or the poodle brought down from the kennels, or all sorts of indulgences, the masseur coming by and maybe calling someone else in another cabin for drinks. Even the dogs lived well on the great liners. On the French line, there were printed gold tasseled menus to pick out Fido's food for dinner before you went to dinner yourself. It was said they had a secret recipe on the French line for dog biscuits that no one else knew. And also that the fact that when dogs traveled on the great liners, they often were never the same. Their owners found them spoiled rotten. They were not right. And on many of the liners, they had miniature fire hydrants on the top deck so the dogs would feel at home. 1931, the British respond with the Empress of Britain, so large, it has a full tennis court on the top deck. And the liners, especially in England, when they were down at dock and even in dry dock out of the water, they would organize train trips down for London for about $5, where you either took a little boat to see the ship, or for a little bit more, invited out for a scone and tea for an afternoon. If you couldn't afford to sail, well, at least you had a little tea party on board one of the ships. 1932, Mussolini said, I'm going to have the biggest ships in the world. So he introduced the Rex and the Conte de Savoia. And he believed that the ships had great political propaganda value, especially in America. So the ship going to Italy would pass the ship at high speed going to New York. Americans in particular would come out on deck and they'd say, wow, this Mussolini, these fascists, this is fascinating. Two ships running together, crisscrossing in the Atlantic at high speed. The Italians were the first to introduce an outdoor pool because sailing to the Mediterranean, you had warmer weather most of the trip. And again, it was used as a tool. The ships were called the floating Rivieras, which will take you to the real Riviera. And Mussolini and his ministers propagandized this and promoted it, and they borrowed a name from Venice, the Lido, and called it the Lido deck. And they even put real sand around the pools with stripe-shirted waiters serving Campari under umbrellas as if you were on the Riviera itself. You can see the main lounge on the Conte di Savoia wasn't quite Art Deco. It was sort of like Sistine Chapel gone to sea. Mussolini had them light the statues from behind, so the effect of the room coming in was just magical. And the room, of course, was absolutely splendid. In 1935, the French spent a whopping 60 million, over $1 billion in today's money, to produce the most magnificent of the great Atlantic liners of that time, the Normandy. The third stack isn't smoking. It has nothing to do with immigrants. It's just where the dog kennels were tucked inside the stack. The Normandy, probably the most ship of its commissioned in 1935. It was the longest, the fastest, the biggest, the best fed, the best decorated liner of its time, no question. And it was true floating Ginger Rogers without question. Some years ago, well, quite a few years ago now, I interviewed Kitty Carlisle, and she sailed on the Normandy, and she told me that going on the Normandy was it's very special. It was the first ship where every lounge and salon just connected, and that ladies had these long dresses that dragged with big cigarette holders, and the whole ship smelled of expensive French perfume and the sounds of Cole Porter songs. The Normandy was extraordinary, and you can see the flow. It was all done in gold with a series of indirect lights, beautifully furnished. There's the main lounge. Those are towers of Lally glass. You can see every chair. The base color is tomato red. Every chair and footstool is hand tapestried in a floral motif, no two alike. The footstools as well. Now an even bigger Orbison carpet, which was rolled up every night so you could dance on the hardwood floor, and then it was unrolled at 2 a.m. and put back in order for the next day. And at night, when they closed the drapes, the room had a magical effect. And you can see the glamour of the Normandy sailing on it in truly an amazing ship. This is the main entrance to the main dining room. Those are 25-foot high bronze doors, which were opened by footmen in livery. You'd be arriving elegantly dressed to attend a meal, again, of unparalleled proportions. Now there were 325 items on the dinner menu. You can see those chairs would be modern today, and the vases, of course, are all Lally. There's the dining room in first class, set 1,000 people at 400 tables. It was done in bronze, Hammond glass, and Lally, and of course, absolutely splendid. All the wines were included, being the French line part of it. Now, by this point, England, Britain, Cunard has moved down to third place. You had the Italians, the Germans, then the Normandy. So Cunard decides it's going to build 2 giant liners. They won't be as luxurious as the Normandy, but they'll be very great ships, and they'll be very fast. So they decide they're going to name the first ship in 1934 Victoria, after old dead Queen Victoria. So as the story goes, the chairman of Cunard went to the king, who was King George V, who was the grandfather of the present queen, and said, "Sir, we'd like to name our new liner, with your permission, after England's greatest queen." And the king misunderstood completely. He said, "My wife will be delighted. I'll tell it tonight." His wife was Queen Mary, so the name happened by accident. And so the ship was named Queen Mary in September 1934 in front of 50,000 people, broadcast by radio throughout England and the Empire. This was a great symbol. The age of depression, the 1930s. If England could build a ship like this, There was hope for tomorrow and hope for the future. It took 4 tons of soap and grease to grease the ways for the Queen Mary to slide into the River Clyde in Scotland, where it was built. And you Canard Line liked to promote the size of the ship. Look at what it would look like in Trafalgar Square. It was indeed absolutely huge. The Queen Mary swept into New York for the first time in June 1936. 100 tugboats surrounded her as she sailed up the Hudson River, and she became one of the most beloved, popular, and cherished liners of all time. One of the great jobs were the bellboys on the ships, and some of them were as young as 14. They delivered messages and lit cigarettes and operated elevators and so forth. They were wonderful, wonderful class among the crew. With the German liners, you could go one way by ship, come home by Zeppelin, the Graf Zeppelin or the Hindenburg, 72 hours to Lakehurst, New Jersey, a kind of QE2 and Concord in later years. But what a voyage, one way by ship, one way by giant Zeppelin. Here's New York in 1937. The liners were all on the west side, by the West Side Highway. Everybody knew the ships. They were all very, very famous. And by this point, the companies were promoting the celebrities that used to sail, like Errol Flynn on the Ile-de-France, or this classic photograph, Marlene Dietrich going to Europe in 1938 with 37 cases. Well, doesn't everybody go to Europe with 37 traces, but it emulates the glamour of the great liners sailing across to Europe. There were proposals for even bigger ships, but by the late 30s, things were changing. War clouds were forming over Europe. They were going to build a super Normandy. It never happened. They were even going to build the Germans a ship with a complete catapult on the front. Again, never happened. This picture from February 1939 at New York is a wonderful photograph. No question about it. Unfortunately, in the years that are about to come, the start of World War II, all but one of these liners are about to be destroyed in the horrors of the Second World War. All the services stopped. By September 1939, everything just about crept to a halt. The Nazis were now fighting on the Western powers, and of course, only the Italian liners stayed, and if you were lucky to get out of Europe, it was quite fortunate. Now, we had a few American liners, and as you know, we were neutral until December 1941. So for Americans who were stranded in Europe, in the fall and winter of 1939, 1940, they put cots in all the lounges so that they could triple the capacity of the ships and get Americans home to safety of America, because you knew times were coming and people accepted this. Helena Rubinstein slept on a sofa for 8 nights. You remember her from Cosmetics. And Arturo Toscanini shared the doctor's cabin for 8 nights just to get out of Europe. It was very, very important. There weren't enough ships, and to leave Europe was so important. And if you had the resources and the ability, if you were Jewish, it was very, very important to leave Europe. And to arrive in that time in the safety of America was so important. To get away from Europe, to be safe, very important. By the winter of 1940, the 3 biggest liners in the world, the Normandy on the top, the Queen Mary in the middle, and the second queen, the Queen Elizabeth, were kept in New York for safety. They didn't want to risk them being attacked at sea, and no one knew what to do with these giant liners. They were just waiting. Well, after America entered the war, after Pearl Harbor in 1941, Churchill and Roosevelt met and decided that the 2 queens should be converted to the biggest troop ships the world has ever seen. Instead of 2,000 passengers in peace, they would carry 15,000 soldiers per trip over to Europe for the eventual invasion of Normandy in 1944. And so the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth became the most heroic ships ever, ocean liners. Each week, one of them left with 15,000 GIs. In July 1943, the Queen Mary left New York with the all-time record that still holds 16,683 on one ship at one time. It was indeed a very, very difficult time. The ships had to sail blacked out at high speed, secret courses, so forth and so on. The only problem they had was chewing gum. It seemed the American GIs like to chew it and stick it on the ceiling, so they banned it. But anyway, it all worked with great precision. The cabins were stripped out, so a 2-bedded room could now sleep 18. The swimming pool could hold 300. They put stacked bunks up and so forth, sometimes a lot tighter than this. This is officer quarters. There you can see how a cabin could be made over. And they had 3 shifts of sleeping during the day. And of course, you had to leave your life jacket on it all the time. During the war, there were 8 sessions of breakfast, 20 minutes apiece. The soldiers came in with a tray, sat down and ate, and then they washed the tray. There was no lunch, and 8 sessions of dinner, also with the soldiers coming in and so forth. Meanwhile, they were going to convert the Normandy, but on February 9th, 1942, sparks from a welder's torch ignited a pile of Kapok life jackets, which immediately caused a fire, which was fanned by the cold winter wind. And so the Normandy, not from Hitler, began to burn right at 48th Street in New York. The brown smoke drifted over Manhattan out to Long Island, and the poor Normandy was thrown so much water on from fireboats that the next day she rolled over and died right in New York Harbor like a big dead whale. At first, they thought they could save it, but no, she was damaged beyond compare. And so little by little, they had to begin to think of how to remove the Normandy and what to do with the remains. And so she was cut down, and at the end of the war, her remains were sold for $160,000 to Newark, New Jersey scrappers. In June 1945, the Queen Mary brought the first soldiers home from the war. The war in Europe was over. The liners had 1 more year to return the soldiers, welcome back to America, a job well done, and they brought home the soldiers, the wounded, the refugees, the last surviving inmates from the German camps. They arrived safely once again in New York Harbor due to the great liners. In the late 40s, it was a return to business. Business looked promising. People began to go to Europe, tourists, businessmen, movie stars. The idea was to get back to business as it used to be. It was decided in America that World War III would probably come and that we would need a big troopship of our own. So President Truman authorized the spending, a huge $70 million in the late 40s, to build the most advanced ocean liner ever built, the SS United States. Built under great secrecy with Navy supervision, it was said that if she pushed hard, she could sail to Europe in 2 days. She could carry as many as 18,000 soldiers if war ever came again. And when she was commissioned in 1952, America was at the peak of its brilliance. The end of the war, the great victor, the technology of America was embodied in this ship. She was so fireproof, the only wood in the entire ship was in the Steinway piano and the butcher's block in the kitchen. She was completely fireproof, which was novel. Even the bedspreads and the drapes were fireproof. She captured the Blue Ribbon, which meant she was the fastest ship to Europe. She made it in 3.5 days. Margaret Truman was on board as a passenger representing her parents, and it was a wonderful time for America. The United States remained very, very popular for the next 10 years, sailing at 98% of capacity. She was the supreme symbol of American fleet. In New York in the 50s, all the great liners used to appear on the West Side. They called it Luxury Liner Row. And you drive along the West Side Highway, and you may be out with grandpa or dad or an uncle, and they'd slow up the car because they knew all the ships that were in. Everybody knew those liners. They were like movie stars. You can see these were simple summer days. It wasn't a holiday. They were all in, going to Oslo and Hamburg and London and Genoa, Lisbon, all the different ports. That was the way to go. They used to come in early in the morning, 7 a.m., unload their passengers, and in those days, they stayed several days in port. And from the Empire State, you could look down over the Hudson River and see the big liners burst in their piers. The Queens were the most popular pair. Every Wednesday, one of them left from New York. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday at sea. Monday afternoon, you got to France, Cherbourg. You can be in Paris for dinner. Monday night, Southampton, up to London by midnight. That was the pattern they had. So businessmen, movie stars, anybody could set their clock on the every Wednesday of the Queen Mary or the Queen Elizabeth. In 1960, for 5 days, it was $400 in first class, $275 in cabin class, which is like business, and $175 down in tourist class. The Queen Mary of the two was the most popular, beloved. There was something in the Queen Mary, in the woodwork even, that just embraced everybody, made them feel they belonged. Crew members at Cunard used to ask to be transferred to the Queen Mary. She just had a magic about her that remained with all of her days. Sailing day, you could go down to the pier and pay 50 cents to go aboard. Passengers would be dressed up in fur stoles, white gloves, patent leather handbags, big corsairs, sailing for Europe. You'd squeeze into a cabin and munch on hors d'oeuvres and champagne. And maybe if you were lucky, you saw a movie star boarding, surrounded by, staff of the ship. And the tugboats at the end of the pier would be a balcony. And in those days, if 2,000 passengers were leaving for Europe, 5,000 visitors came down to say goodbye. It was a big event. You took the morning off from work. Nowadays, no one will leave you, drive you to the airport. But in those days, Bon Voyage was a big event. And of course, the people who were sailing, relatives or friends, you weren't going to see them for a long time, weeks, months maybe. And the ship from the end of the pier looked huge. And the sound of those huge whistles just clutched your heart, the emotion of it all. Sailing, grandma going to Europe, and she became a smaller and smaller figure, a little hanky waving from the deck as she goes off to Europe for the summer. And the Moran tugs would push the ship out into the river, and down and off to Europe they would grow, past the skyline, and of course, Bon Voyage for a while. And today, of course, we have internet. We can communicate from a cruise ship anywhere in the world. But in those days, you had to wait till you got to Europe, you wrote your letter, your postcard, then they were mailed, and then they came back. So it was at least 2 or 3 weeks before you got a message from the friend who was on board. Cunard had the best slogan: getting there is half the fun. And indeed it was. The ships were often booked a year in advance. They sped across to Europe, 28.5 knots, 5 days to England. How fantastic. And if you were lucky in the summer, at decks, there was bullion at 11, tea at 4, and you just rested before you were going on your European tour, or very tired after a long European tour. And very often the steward would wrap you into one of those wonderful blankets, and you just nodded off and inhaled that wonderful sea air. It was part of the voyage. But at other times, especially in winter, the North Atlantic could be quite sinister and quite evil, no question about it. So you retreated to the indoor promenade and were protected, and you'd be reading your murder mystery, and suddenly your eyes lifted up, and there was Rita Hayworth, or Cary Grant, or the Duchess of Windsor strolling by, because the great liners were like great hotels. They were the great travel. In the 50s, on the Queen Mary, you can see it was like the best hotel in London, except it moved. The carpets were so thick, your shoe would disappear. The whole room smelled of leather, fresh flowers, and floor wax. And the 3 things meshed together made this aromatic smell. And the staff was all hand-picked. Everything was yes, sir, and yes, madam. And the ceiling was 3 decks high. And dinner, of course, the chef came to the table to debone the fish or carve the beef, wearing his big puff hat and an immaculate uniform. And the big suites had those big Bakelite phones and the forced air. And the tub had 4 taps, hot and cold fresh, hot and cold salt water. And a bath, of course, was a big ritual on the liners in travel. And you can see on some ships, the decor was really sort of late Hedy Lamarr, that big mirror with the bed and so forth, a trunk room, a sitting room, and so on. The companies, again, promoted the great stars that sailed on their ships, like Elizabeth Taylor on the Queen Elizabeth in 1955, or the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who, by the way, sailed twice a year across the Atlantic to come to New York, and they never sailed with less than 98 pieces of luggage, plus the 5 pugs. It was indeed quite a royal process, and so on. And you can imagine going into the library, which was popular, you'd sit down to write postcards or a letter, and there was Ginger Rogers, the woman you'd seen on the big screen. Maybe she smiled, maybe she said good morning, and it made your voyage. It was part of that whole impactful world of ocean liners and the great movie stars and celebrities. Gregory Peck, as you can see here, and so on, and Charles Boyer, and as you can see, Spencer Tracy on one of the liners. And you're strolling on the promenade deck and you happen to see them. And when you got to England, you were beginning your vacation. There were a lot of sort of ideas in the late 50s about new things for the future, like $50 to Europe on gigantic liners and so forth, futuristic ships that never happened. And look at this one from the Germans by 1960. These projects never materialized. By 1957, knocking on the door were the airlines. In October 1958, the first jet flight goes between New York and London. 6 days becomes 6 hours. Cunard announces the next day, flying is a fad, it'll pass. It's a mere ripple in the road. Well, in 6 months, the airlines had 2/3 of all the business. And in 5 years, they had 98%. In this picture in the 60s, the big liners are dinosaurs. They're empty. You could be sitting in the lounge with the violinists alone. The movie stars, the tourists, the school teachers, the secretaries, all took to the skies. The Queen Mary finished up out in Southern California after 31 years, where she's a museum and a hotel. The Queen Elizabeth didn't do as well. She was eventually sold to a Chinese tycoon and burned in Hong Kong Harbor in 1972. And so sadly rolled over on its side and had to be cut up and made into razor blades and Toyotas, the sad ending of the Queen Elizabeth. However, by the mid-60s, Cunard thought there was reason for one last sentimental liner, and they went forward with a new ship that they would call the Queen Elizabeth II, named by the Queen in September 1967. And when it was commissioned in 1969, even the London papers said that it's a folly. It's too late. People go by plane now. They won't sail to Europe anymore. But Cunard was very clever, and by the 70s and 80s, they made friends with British Airways. You could sail one way, fly the other, or even better, sail one way and go Concorde the other, 3.5 hours to London. The QE2 turned out to be a big success. She sailed for 39 more years, and when she was sold to Dubai in 2008 to become a hotel, she was worth 10 million in scrap. Dubai paid the Cunard $100 million because the ship was so famous. So now Carnival, which is very clever in making money and owns Cunard, built the Queen Mary II to continue the legacy of the old liners. Yes, she goes cruising part of the year. Cruising is different, as you know, where you visit places for the day and then you sail on. But it's all part of the package. And it's interesting that the Queen Mary II sails in and out of Brooklyn, Red Hook. In fact, we have the former manager of the terminal right here with us sitting today and handled it. So what's on the boards ahead? What's coming? More people will be sailing than ever in history once we get over COVID. There's, as I said, 100 new ships being built. There's plans for more. I used to say never. Now I never say never. They're building more residence ships where you buy the apartment on board and it's yours from 1 to 8 million. If you want to see me after the thing, I'll take your check. But nonetheless, it's all a wonderful thing. Thank you very, very much. Now, if we have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you. No? Yes. Sadly, the SS United States is a sad story. It was decommissioned in 1969 because it needed money from Washington to keep sailing, and the government said no more subsidies. So she's been laid up now for 52 years. She's in Philadelphia, not in very good condition. They keep making plans to bring her back, but I'd be a little, it'll cost $400 or $500 million to restore her. So, but she's still around. She hasn't left. Yes. Yes. The lady is asking whatever happened to another great American liner, the Constitution. By the way, the Constitution has 2 claims to fame before I tell you what happened. In 1955, they used the ship for an episode of I Love Lucy, where she misses the ship and has to land by helicopter in the harbor. And in those days, I Love Lucy was seen by 39 million viewers on Monday nights. What publicity for the Constitution. The next year, 1956, they heard the shipping lines, American export lines, that an American actress was going to Nice to marry a prince. She was flying on Air France to Nice. So they offered her 50 free cabins on the Constitution, family and wedding party. You know the story. Grace Kelly going to marry Prince Rainier, and she sailed across on the Constitution. A year later, 1957, a new movie with Deborah Kerr and Cary Grant was coming out in a fairy tale romance. They come from Europe to America, and it's, of course, an affair to remember on the Constitution. The Constitution later became a Hawaiian cruise ship, and on its way to the scrapyard in 1997, the tow line snapped and it sank. It never made. So it's at the bottom of the Pacific. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes, the sister ship. I think all of you, maybe, well, most of you remember that on a summer's night in July 1956, a Swedish ship called the Stockholm crashed into the Andrea Doria off Nantucket, and the next morning the Andrea Doria sank, and over 50 people perished. And it was the first ship tragedy ever brought through television, black and white news, to your living room to see this big liner sink. And here's an interesting little thing. The Stockholm, which was built the year I was born in 1948, is still around 9 names later, cruising the seas. So the little Stockholm has endured for some reason, I don't know why. But the Andrea Doria was a big yes. Of course, cancellation, she was gone. Yes, absolutely. By the way, a little statistic. When the Independence and Constitution were commissioned in 1951, they were the first fully air-conditioned ships in the world. You could go into your cabin, and instead of having to open the porthole or having one of those fans on the wall, you could have a thermostat and make your cabin cooler or warmer. So that was a novelty in 1951. So very interesting. They were very important, great ships. Anybody else? Yes. No, it was not to the pandemic of 1918. It was not. And why that was, I can't answer. I don't know. But as you know, cruising has stopped now for about 13 months. So all these ships are sitting around the world. And it's estimated that the cruise industry at large is losing $287,000 every minute. Staggering, isn't it? And plus they have all these 100 new ships coming out as well. So we'll see what happens, but they're all hankering to come back. And I've been lecturing on ships for 40 years. I'm not hankering, but I'll be glad to go back. It is a wonderful world. There's no question about it. It's wonderful. And it's interesting how the Oceania Cruises just announced a around the world cruise of 210 days, 98 stops in 57 countries. The cruise sold out in 7 hours. People are just dying to sail. They want to go back to that world. And, you know, there's so many even young married couples now with 2.2 kids who love to go to the Caribbean for a week on a ship, Disney or Royal Caribbean or Carnival, and have fun. And of course, you've got the other end of people who can afford to, you know, take 2 or 3 suites if they want, and so forth. There was a couple on the Queen Mary. They used to take all of the 6 suites for the round the world cruise for 100 days. And they would invite friends to fill 4 of them. One was to sleep in, and one was to entertain in. And the fare for when they bought the 6 suites paid the fuel bill for the ship for 3 months. So you think they were well looked after? I think they got extra Brussels sprouts at night, don't you? They absolutely did. And they loaned the cargo hatch to the wife because she was an inveterate shopper. And every port she went to, she'd shop mercilessly. She'd have so many goods to take home. They gave her the cargo hatch in the ship and she filled it up. Where she put all this stuff, I don't know, because they lived grandly offshore as well. But one last very thing, and then I'll let you go. They were also very kind. There was a maitre d' that looked after them, taking care of them for years. And the husband said one time to the man, well, how do you get home when you get back to England? He said, oh, I take 2 trains and then 2 buses to get to where I live. He said, you do? But when they got back to England, waiting on the pier, was a brand new Range Rover with a big red bow and a note from them. Thank you for everything you've done. So we now had a Range Rover to drive home as a gift from them. How wonderful. Very nice. Anyhow, thank you so much. Memory Lane, the Great Liners, Steamer Trunk, Whistle, Bon Voyage. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see it. Member belonged to the P&O line. It was a very famous ship. Yes, it went to the Boneyard in Pakistan in 1997. It lasted for about 43 years. What year was that? It was running out of New York then for a short time. That's right. Very interesting. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, sir. Sure. Oh, sure. It was an Italian ship. Yes. Isn't that interesting? Wonderful. Wonderful. By the way, in case you need to know this, when the rich and famous sail, most of them never use money for gratuity. And the reason theory was the process was they would give a picture of themselves as a gratuity. But this traveled to all of Great Britain. And on the return voyage, if they had the same steward or waiter, they would take the picture. I'll give you an example. Mae West going to Europe. Give a picture of herself to the steward who did everything for her, you know, brought her lunch and flowers and whatever. And then when she's coming back 3 months later, she said to him, "Where's that picture I gave you of myself?" He said, "It's down in my cabinet. Go and get it." She runs down, runs back up. She takes out her gold Cartier pen and signs her name. And that's the gratuity for the return voyage. And that's what they all did. Give her and then sign it. As a gratuity. But everybody loved it anyway. They were not considered cheap by any means. But they were just another world type of people. Different age. Exactly. We went to 25 rounds on the normal day. 8 courses, took 3 hours to finish it. Say hi to Tony, everybody. Yes, Tony.
Thank you so much for absolutely wonderful.
My pleasure.